saying there wasn't much more they could do. Every time we visited, she seemed smaller, weaker. The last few days had been the hardest. Mom had always been the strongest person I knew, vibrant, full of life, but now, it was hard to recognize the woman lying in that sterile bed, hooked up to machines, unable to even hold a conversation. I tried not to think about it too much, tried to ignore the nagging thought in the back of my mind that things were only getting worse. But it was hard when the hospital felt like a constant reminder of how fragile everything was. Dad had insisted on taking me home late that night. He'd been quiet during the drive, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his eyes often glancing at the rearview mirror. We'd spent hours at the hospital, and there was a certain heaviness about the way he looked at me. I knew it was weighing on him. The guilt, the worry, the fear. He didn't say it out loud, but I could see it in his face every time he glanced at me. Mom wasn't getting better, and none of us knew how much time we had left. I didn't want to think about that. It felt too big to hold in my head. So I stared out the window, watching the road stretch out before us, empty and quiet under the dim glow of the headlights. The world felt strange at that hour, like everything had been swallowed up by the darkness. The rain blurred the road, the trees, everything, into dark smudges. I was so tired, I could barely keep my eyes open, and the monotonous sound of the rain against the roof had a soothing quality to it. The car felt like a small, safe space against the storm, but even then, there was a tightness in my chest, like something wasn't right. It was the kind of tired that doesn't let you fight it anymore. And soon, I drifted off, my head heavy against the window. I don't remember exactly when I fell asleep, but I was jolted awake, my body jerking in my seat as the car lurched violently to the side. My eyes shot open, and everything was a blur. The rain pounded harder against the windows, and the world outside seemed to be spinning with the motion of the car. Dad, my voice came out shaky as I blinked in the dark. I could hear his voice, frantic but steady. "Lily, are you okay? Hold on." The sound of his voice cut through the fog in my brain, pulling me fully awake, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes locked on him as he struggled with the steering wheel, the car sliding across the slick road. It all happened so fast. The tires screeched, the engine roared, and then nothing. Just the deafening crash of the car slamming into something hard. The rain didn't stop. It just kept falling. "Lily, are you okay?" The sound of my dad's voice yanked me out of the haze. My head snapped up, and my heart pounded, slamming against my ribs as I tried to process what was happening. The car was skidding across the wet road, everything spinning in slow motion, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, the tires squealing against the slick asphalt, the engine roaring in protest. The heavy rain hammered against the windows, blurring the world outside into a dark, swirling mess. Then, without warning, there was a sickening, gut-wrenching crash. The force threw me forward, my seatbelt jerking violently against my chest. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just bracing myself for what was coming next. My head collided with the headrest, and the world tilted on its axis as the car slammed into something solid. I heard metal crumple, glass shatter. My body felt like it had been tossed around inside the car like a rag. "Dad," I gasped, my voice strained, dry with panic. My throat was tight, the words barely escaping, as I tried to make sense of the chaos. The car had stopped, but everything felt wrong, too quiet. I turned my head toward him, heart racing. He was already checking on me, his hands moving with quick, practiced efficiency. His fingers brushed over my arms, my face, looking for any sign of injury. His movements sharp but calm. "I'm fine." "You're fine," he said, his voice steady in a way that didn't match the panic building inside me. But the calmness in his voice didn't make me feel better. It just made me feel more out of place, more aware of the uneasy silence settling over us. His hand wiped across his face in frustration, and then he turned to the dashboard, squinting at the damage, his jaw clenched as he inspected the situation. "We must have driven over something," he muttered, staring at the tires. "Both tires are done for." I glanced out the window, but the only thing I could see was a blurry mess of rain and blackness. The storm had swallowed everything. There was no way to make out what we had hit. No way to see anything beyond the isolation of the road stretching out in front of us. "What happened?" I whispered, my voice small, the weight of the unknown pressing on me. He turned to me with a half-hearted smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, trying to comfort me, but I could see the tension in his face. "It's all right," he said, but his words felt thin, like they were meant more to reassure himself than me. "I've got a spare in the boot." I'll walk back into town, get some help. His eyes met mine, full of concern, but there was something else too, something masked by the calmness. He was trying to make me feel safe, trying to act like everything was fine, when I could feel the unease crawling under my skin. He paused, glancing out into the rain for a moment, before returning his gaze to me. "You stay in the car. I'll be back in a bit." I nodded, but the words barely passed my lips, a tightness in my chest growing. Okay, the words felt hollow. They weren't enough. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling inside me, like something wasn't right. The silence pressed in on all sides, and the night outside was too dark, too heavy. The air itself felt thick with something I couldn't place. Dad slammed the car door shut, the sound cutting through the quiet with an odd finality. I watched him walk off into the rain, his figure growing smaller, swallowed by the downpour almost immediately. The sound of his footsteps, wet against the road, faded into the storm, swallowed by the night. I sat there, frozen, eyes locked on the space where he had disappeared, willing him to turn around and come back. I tried to breathe, tried to force myself to relax, but the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. The rain pounded against the car, a relentless, constant noise that did nothing to ease the sick feeling growing in my stomach. Minutes dragged into an hour. Then 2, still, no sign of Dad. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, hoping to see him, hoping that somehow he'd just gotten lost in the storm, but there was nothing. The road behind me was just a blur of shadows, the rain smudging everything together, a curtain that separated me from the world outside. My eyes kept darting back and forth, searching for a sign, a movement to anything, but the darkness swallowed everything. Where was he? I pulled my phone out of my bag, my hands shaking slightly as I checked the time again. It was getting late, too late, and still no Dad. A cold chill ran down my spine, my fingers trembling as I clutched the phone tighter. I couldn't explain it, but the air had changed. The night felt heavier now, the silence more suffocating. My pulse quickened, every nerve in my body on edge. Something wasn't right. It was like the night had shifted somehow, like it had turned into something darker, more dangerous. The weight of the storm pressing against the car made everything feel suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wasn't ready for. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, my breath caught in my throat, a chill crawling up my spine. There was someone walking toward the car. At first, I thought it was Dad, coming back from wherever he'd gone, but as my eyes focused, the truth hit me like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't him. The figure was tall, much taller than Dad, and there was something wrong about the way he moved. His clothes were strange old, tattered overalls, hanging off his gaunt frame. His beard was wild, thick, and unkempt, like it hadn't been trimmed in years. But it wasn't his appearance that made my blood run cold. It was the way he carried himself, like he didn't belong in the world. He was holding something in his hand, swinging it carelessly back and forth, like it was an extension of his arm. For a moment, I couldn't even tell what it was. My heart raced, unease crawling beneath my skin, twisting in my stomach. Who was this guy? The figure drew closer, and I leaned forward, my hands trembling as I tried to see through the fogged-up glass. The dim light barely cut through the storm, but I could make out a glint, something shiny in his other hand. I focused, and my blood turned to ice. A butcher's knife. The blade was long, gleaming with an unsettling shine, and it looked far too large for comfort. My heart stopped. A wave of panic crashed over me, and my hands moved instinctively, fumbling for the door lock. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe, only reacted in frantic, desperate motions. Lock the front doors, get in the back, lock those too. My body was shaking uncontrollably, every nerve screaming at me to do something, anything. But all I could do was scramble, trapped by the terror paralyzing me. The man stopped just behind the car. My breath froze in my chest. He was looking at me. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I couldn't tear my gaze from him. My instincts screamed at me to hide, to duck down and pray he wouldn't see me, but my body refused to listen. He took a slow, deliberate step closer. His boots squelched in the mud, each step pulling him nearer to the car. I pressed myself back against the seat, wishing the world would swallow me whole, wishing I could become invisible. But he saw me. I didn't know how, but I felt it. His eyes locked onto mine with a cold, unblinking intensity. Then, I saw it. In his left hand, he was holding something else, something that made my blood run even colder. A human head, my father's head. The world seemed to tilt. the edges of reality blurring. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. My throat was so tight, so constricted, that I thought I might suffocate right there, in the car. My mind racing to make sense of the impossible sight in front of me. The head dangled from his hand like a grotesque doll, lifeless and limp. My father's face was pale, drained of all color, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. His eyes were rolled back in his head, glazed over, unseeing. Blood soaked his hair, dripping down onto the man's arm, pooling around his hand like it was nothing. But the man didn't even flinch. He didn't seem to care. The sight of it was too much to bear. I wanted to look away, to escape, but my body was frozen in place. I was trapped, a spectator to the nightmare unfolding before me. And then he was closer. His face pressed up against the window, his breath fogging the glass. The windows were blurry, wet, but through the mist, I could see his eyes, clearly wild, feverish, and bloodshot. There was no recognition in them, no humanity, just madness. His lips curled into a smile, twisted and cruel, as if he reveled in my terror. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat, strangled by the horror that had settled into my bones. My hands were shaking as I grabbed for the door handle, but it didn't matter. The car was my prison, and I was its captive. He reached into his pocket, pulling something out. I could barely see it at first, but as he held it up to the window, the dim light flickered across the metal. It was my father's car keys. He jingled them in front of me, like they were a toy, something to taunt me with, before he let them drop slowly onto the wet pavement. The sound of the keys hitting the ground echoed in the car, deafening in the quiet night, like a final confirmation that everything I knew had just shattered. And then, as casually as he had appeared, he turned. Without another word, he walked back into the storm, disappearing into the rain, leaving only the sound of the downpour behind him. I sat there, motionless, unable to move, my mind spinning in circles. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened, but the chill of that moment lingered, a dark, suffocating presence in the air. I was alone, completely alone, and the night had swallowed everything whole. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the keys on the road, unable to move, unable to breathe. My chest felt tight, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, to do something, but I couldn't. I just sat there, in the dark, in the rain, with the silence of the night swallowing everything whole.